In a weathered music studio overlooking the foggy hills of Ashwood Valley, Lucian Shaw, founder of one of America's most powerful tech empires, found himself on his knees before a man in faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt. "Please," Lucian whispered, his voice breaking with 3 years of desperation, "help my daughter. She hasn't smiled since the day she lost her sight." The man studied the 19-year-old, sitting motionless in the corner, her unseeing eyes fixed on nothing, her face an emotionless mask that had become her prison. Orion Reed walked to his old piano, his calloused fingers finding keys that had gathered dust for months. As the first gentle notes filled the air, something impossible happened. For the first time since the accident that stole her vision, Alara Shaw's lips curved into the faintest smile. Neither man could have imagined the devastating secret that connected them, or how one song would unravel everything they thought they knew about that terrible night. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Lucian Shaw had commanded boardrooms, where trillion-dollar decisions were made with a single nod, where his voice could reshape entire industries overnight. At 52, he was the undisputed king of Silicon Valley, the visionary behind Neuralink Technologies, whose revolutionary brain-computer interfaces had transformed everything from medical treatment to space exploration. Fortune magazine had called him the mind reader for his uncanny ability to predict technological trends years before they emerged. Yet here he was, in a cramped music studio that smelled of old wood and forgotten dreams, pleading with a man whose net worth probably wouldn't cover the cost of Lucian's monthly car payment. The studio sat perched on a hillside in Ashwood Valley, a forgotten corner of Northern California, where morning fog rolled through ancient redwoods like ghostly fingers. It was the kind of place Lucian would never have noticed during his rocket ship ascent to the top of the tech world. The kind of place that existed in the margins of maps and the periphery of ambition. But desperation had a way of redrawing all the maps. Orion Reed stood behind an old upright piano, his weathered hands resting on keys that had seen better decades. He was everything Lucian wasn't: monitored, unpolished, unimpressed by the billions of dollars that had just walked through his door. His flannel shirt was soft with age, his jeans bore honest stains from honest work, and his eyes held the kind of depth that only came from understanding real loss. In the corner of the studio, Alara Shaw sat with the stillness of carved marble. At 19, she possessed the kind of ethereal beauty that should have graced magazine covers and red carpets. Her long auburn hair caught what little light filtered through the dusty windows, and her features held the refined elegance inherited from generations of Shaw family portraits. But her eyes, those striking green eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and mischief, now stared unseeing into a darkness that had consumed her world 3 years ago. More devastating than her blindness was the absence of any expression whatsoever. Alara's face had become a perfect mask of emptiness, beautiful and terrible in its complete lack of emotion. She hadn't smiled since the night her world went dark. She hadn't laughed, hadn't cried, hadn't shown anger or joy, or sadness or hope. She existed in a state of suspended animation, breathing and eating and moving through the motions of life, while remaining utterly disconnected from any experience of actually living. Lucian had spent the last 3 years watching his daughter disappear by degrees, retreating further into herself with each passing day. The vibrant young woman, who had once debated philosophy with university professors and composed hauntingly beautiful poetry, had been replaced by this silent ghost, who responded to the world with mechanical compliance, but no engagement. "Mr. Reed," Lucian began, his voice carrying none of the authority that made senators return his calls and world leaders seek his counsel. Here, in this humble studio, he was just a father whose money meant nothing in the face of his daughter's pain. "I know this is unconventional. I know you don't know us from anyone, but I've tried everything money can buy, and my daughter is slipping away from me." Orion's eyes moved from Lucian's expensive suit to Alara's motionless form, and something flickered across his weathered features. Recognition, perhaps, or memory, or simply the universal understanding of what it meant to watch someone you love become unreachable. I don't take clients anymore, Orion said quietly, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of someone who had sung too many songs in too many smoky venues. Haven't for a long time. Whatever you've heard about me, whatever brought you here, you're about 3 years too late. The rejection hit Lucian like a physical blow, but he pressed on with the desperation of a man who had exhausted every other option. He'd heard about Orion Reed through a chain of whispered recommendations that had led him from the marble halls of Stanford Medical Center to the coffee shops of Berkeley, from the alternative healing centers of Marin County to this forgotten studio in the hills. The stories had been almost mythical in nature. A musician who could reach people that traditional therapy couldn't touch. Someone who used music not as entertainment but as medicine, who could unlock emotional doors that had been welded shut by trauma and time. Lucian had dismissed the stories at first, filed them under the category of New Age nonsense that desperate people clung to when science failed them. But when your daughter hasn't smiled in 3 years, you start believing in miracles. Please, Lucian said, the word catching in his throat like a confession. Just look at her, really look at her. She used to light up rooms just by walking into them. She had this laugh that made everyone around her want to laugh too. She would get so excited about ideas that she'd pace around my office, gesturing wildly while she explained some new concept she'd discovered. His voice broke as the memories overwhelmed him. She was studying neuroscience at Stanford, you know. Youngest person ever admitted to their doctoral program. She wanted to use technology to help people with traumatic brain injuries recover their memories, their personalities, their sense of self. She said everyone deserved to feel whole. Orion glanced at Alara again, noting how she sat with perfect posture but complete disconnection, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. What happened to her? Orion asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Lucian closed his eyes, the question hitting him like it always did, with the force of a hammer blow to the chest. Car accident. 3 years ago, a drunk driver ran a red light and hit her car head-on. The impact caused severe optic nerve damage. The doctors said the blindness was irreversible, but that wasn't the worst part. He opened his eyes and looked at his daughter with an expression of infinite sadness. The worst part was watching her disappear. Day by day, week by week, she just retreated further inside herself. It's like the accident didn't just take her sight, it took her spirit, her joy, her connection to everything that made life worth living. Orion was quiet for a long moment, his hand still resting on the piano keys. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more careful. I'm sorry for what happened to your daughter, Mr. Shaw. I truly am, but I can't help her. I can't help anyone anymore. The finality in his voice was unmistakable, but Lucian Shaw hadn't built a tech empire by accepting no for an answer. I'll pay you whatever you want, $1 million, 10 million. I'll fund any project you want, any cause you believe in. I'll build you a state-of-the-art facility, hire any staff you need. It's not about money, Orion said firmly, stepping away from the piano. Some things can't be bought. That was when something unexpected happened. As Orion moved away from the instrument, his elbow accidentally bumped against the keys, producing a single clear note that rang through the studio like a bell. The sound was nothing special, just a middle C played on an old piano that could have used tuning. But in the silence that followed, Lucian saw something that made his heart nearly stop. Alara's head turned slightly toward the sound. It was the smallest possible movement, barely perceptible, but it was the first time in 3 years that his daughter had shown any unprompted reaction to anything in her environment. She didn't smile, didn't speak, didn't move again, but for just that one moment, something had stirred behind her vacant expression. Orion had seen it too. His weathered face showed surprise, then something that might have been hope, then a careful guarding of that hope, as if it were too fragile to trust. Play something, Lucian whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Please, just one song. Orion looked at Alara again, studying her with the intensity of a man trying to solve a puzzle. Then, almost against his better judgment, he returned to the piano bench and placed his hands on the keys. What emerged was nothing like what Lucian had expected. No grand symphony or complex composition, but something simple and pure. A gentle melody that seemed to capture the essence of rain falling on leaves, of sunlight breaking through clouds, of all the small moments of beauty that made life worth living, even in the darkest times. As the music filled the studio, Alara's expression began to change in ways so subtle they were almost imaginary. Her breathing seemed to slow and deepen. Her shoulders, which had been held in permanent tension for 3 years, seemed to relax by degrees. And then, impossibly, incredibly, the corners of her mouth curved upward in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Lucian felt tears streaming down his face as he watched his daughter's first smile in 3 years bloom like a flower after a long winter. It lasted only seconds before disappearing back into her usual mask of emptiness, but it had been real. It had been there. His daughter was still somewhere inside that beautiful broken shell. When the last note faded into silence, Orion sat staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. The song had affected him too, Lucian realized. There was something raw and vulnerable in his expression, as if the music had unlocked doors in his own heart that he'd been trying to keep closed. "I haven't played that song in 3 years," Orion said quietly, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to suppress. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lucian sensed that he was on the edge of something important, something that could change everything for Alara, but he also understood that pushing too hard might shatter this fragile moment of possibility. "Will you try?" Lucian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Will you work with her?" Orion looked at Alara one more time, taking in her return to motionless silence, but also remembering that brief, incredible smile. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man making a decision that would change multiple lives. "I can't promise anything," he said slowly. "Music isn't magic. It can't fix everything that's broken, and I'm not the man I used to be." "But you'll try?" Orion nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "I'll try, but we do this my way, in my time, with no pressure and no expectations. The moment I think it's not helping her, or if I think it's making things worse, we stop. No arguments, no negotiations, no more money thrown at the problem." Relief flooded through Lucian with such intensity that his knees nearly buckled. For the first time in 3 years, he had hope. Real, tangible hope that his daughter might find her way back to the world of the living. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words carrying 3 years of desperate gratitude. "Thank you for giving her a chance." As they worked out the practical details, when Alara would come, how often, what the sessions would involve, Lucian couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Orion Reed's story than the man was revealing. The way he'd reacted to that song, the sadness in his eyes when he'd said he hadn't played it in 3 years, the careful way he'd agreed to help despite clearly not wanting to get involved. But those were questions for another day. For now it was enough that his daughter had smiled, and that someone had finally agreed to help her find her way back to the light. Lucian Shaw's corner office occupied the entire 50th floor of the gleaming Neuralink Tower, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of San Francisco Bay. On clear days, he could see all the way to the Marin Headlands, but today fog rolled across the water like a gray blanket, softening the edges of the city below. The office itself was a monument to understated power. Sleek lines, carefully chosen art, and technology so advanced it seemed like magic. Voice-activated displays materialized in mid-air at his command, showing real-time data from Neuralink's global operations, stock prices, research breakthroughs, manufacturing statistics, all flowing across invisible screens that responded to his thoughts as much as his words. But it was the personal touches that revealed the man behind the empire. On his massive glass desk sat a collection of photographs that chronicled a life beyond quarterly earnings and market dominance. Lucian with his late wife Serafina at their wedding, her dark eyes sparkling with laughter as she fed him cake. Family vacations in Tuscany, where Alara had been perhaps 8 years old, her face bright with joy as she chased fireflies through olive groves. Alara's high school graduation, where she delivered the valedictorian speech with such eloquence that grown men had wept. The largest photograph showed the three of them at Alara's Stanford acceptance celebration, taken just 4 years ago but feeling like a lifetime. Serafina had been radiant in a way that seemed to light up everyone around her, her arm around their daughter, who was practically vibrating with excitement about starting her doctoral program. Lucian remembered that night with crystal clarity. How proud he'd been of Alara's achievements, how grateful he'd felt for the perfect life they'd built together. He'd had no way of knowing that within 8 months, both his wife and daughter would be gone from him in completely different but equally devastating ways. The Neuralink empire had started 23 years earlier in a garage in Palo Alto, where a young Lucian Shaw had been convinced that the future lay in the intersection between human consciousness and digital technology. His first prototype, a crude device that could translate basic thoughts into computer commands, had been laughed at by venture capitalists who called it science fiction. But Lucian had possessed the rare combination of visionary thinking and practical engineering that separated true innovators from mere dreamers. Within 5 years, Neuralink's brain-computer interfaces were helping paralyzed patients control robotic limbs with their thoughts. Within 10 years, they were allowing blind people to see through digital implants. Within 15 years, Neuralink technology was powering everything from advanced prosthetics to space exploration equipment. Now at 52, Lucian controlled a company worth over $300 billion, with research facilities on every continent and products that had fundamentally changed what it meant to be human in the 21st century. Presidents called him for advice on technology policy. Nobel Prize winners sought his funding for their research. His annual letter to shareholders was studied like scripture by investors around the world. Yet all of that success felt meaningless when he looked at the empty chair where Alara used to sit during their weekly father-daughter lunches. She'd been his greatest pride and his closest confidant, the brilliant young woman who understood both the technical complexities of his work and its broader implications for humanity. Serafina had been the heart of their family, but Alara had been its future. She'd inherited her mother's compassion and her father's intellect, combining them into something uniquely powerful. While other teenagers were posting on social media, Alara had been publishing papers on neuroplasticity in peer-reviewed journals. While her classmates worried about prom dates, she'd been developing theories about using technology to help trauma victims recover suppressed memories. Her plan had been ambitious even by Shaw family standards: complete her doctorate at 21. Then use Neuralink's resources to develop revolutionary treatments for traumatic brain injuries. She'd wanted to create a world where no one would have to live with the kind of cognitive damage that had affected her maternal grandfather after his stroke. Everyone deserves to feel complete, she told Lucian during one of their last conversations before the accident. Everyone deserves to have access to their own memories, their own emotions, their own sense of self. Technology should be a bridge back to wholeness, not just a way to make rich people richer. The irony was almost unbearable. Alara had wanted to heal broken minds, and now her own brilliant mind was trapped behind walls that no amount of technology seemed able to breach. Serafina had died 2 years before the accident, her battle with pancreatic cancer, fought with the same grace and determination she'd brought to everything else in her life. During her final weeks, she'd made Lucian promise to take care of Alara, to make sure their daughter never lost sight of her compassion in the pursuit of success. "She's going to change the world," Serafina had whispered during one of their last conversations, her hand squeezing his with surprising strength. "But promise me you won't let her become hard. Promise me you'll protect the part of her that sees technology as a way to help people, not just a way to solve problems. It was a promise Lucian was failing spectacularly to keep. Since the accident, he'd thrown every resource at his disposal at the problem of Alara's condition. The world's leading neurologists had examined her, finding no physical reason for her emotional withdrawal. Psychiatrists from Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and the Mayo Clinic had tried everything from traditional talk therapy to experimental drug treatments. He'd flown her to Switzerland for cutting-edge treatments, to Japan for holistic approaches, to Israel for military-grade trauma therapy protocols. Nothing had worked. The medical consensus was that Alara's withdrawal was a psychological defense mechanism, her mind's way of protecting itself from processing the trauma of the accident. But understanding the cause didn't provide a cure. If anything, it made the situation more frustrating because it meant the tools to heal her existed somewhere inside her own mind. They just couldn't figure out how to access them. Lucian had tried everything money could buy. Private chefs who specialized in foods that might stimulate neural pathways. Personal trainers who used movement therapy to unlock emotional blocks. Art therapists, dance therapists, equine therapists, even a practitioner of something called vibrational healing, who claimed she could cure trauma with singing bowls. Each failure had been another small death, another confirmation that his wealth and influence meant nothing in the face of his daughter's pain. He could revolutionize entire industries, but he couldn't make his own daughter smile. The worst part was watching her go through the motions of living without any apparent experience of actually being alive. She ate when food was placed in front of her, but seemed to taste nothing. She submitted to medical examinations with perfect compliance, but showed no interest in the results. She answered direct questions with monosyllabic responses but initiated no conversations. Most heartbreaking of all, she'd stopped creating. Before the accident, Alara had been constantly working on projects, research papers, poetry, musical compositions, coding experiments. Her mind had been a perpetual motion machine of curiosity and creativity. Now she sat for hours in perfect stillness, apparently thinking about nothing at all. Lucian had rearranged his entire life around Alara's condition. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at Neuralink, delegating responsibilities to trusted executives so he could focus on finding a way to reach his daughter. His social life had evaporated as he'd become consumed with the search for treatments, cures, anything that might spark some response. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd revolutionized brain-computer interfaces couldn't figure out how to interface with his own daughter's broken brain. Friends and colleagues had suggested that maybe it was time to accept Alara's condition as permanent, to focus on helping her develop coping strategies, rather than searching for a cure. Some had gently implied that his obsession with fixing her was becoming unhealthy for both of them. But Lucian couldn't give up. Not when he remembered how Alara's face had lit up when she'd figured out a particularly challenging mathematical proof. Not when he could still hear her laughter echoing through the halls of their Nob Hill mansion. Not when he'd made a promise to Serafina that he intended to keep, even if it killed him. The search for Orion Reed had begun 6 months earlier, when a psychiatrist at UCSF had mentioned hearing about a music therapist who'd had unusual success with trauma patients. The doctor had been vague about details, admitting she'd only heard rumors, but something about the story had caught Lucian's attention. It had taken weeks of following leads through San Francisco's alternative healing community before he'd gotten a name, and weeks more before he'd tracked down Orion's location in Ashwood Valley. Multiple sources had warned him that Orion Reed no longer took clients, that he'd retreated from the world after some kind of personal tragedy. But Lucian had been determined to try. Now driving back from that first encounter in the fog-shrouded hills, Lucian felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years: hope. Not the desperate grasping hope he'd felt after each new doctor's appointment or experimental treatment, but something quieter and more sustainable. Alara had smiled. For just a moment his daughter had connected with something outside herself,
had shown a flicker of the person she used to be. It wasn't a cure, wasn't even close to a cure, but it was proof that she was still there somewhere, still reachable. The smile had lasted maybe 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds had been worth more than all the billions in his bank accounts. As the lights of San Francisco emerged from the fog ahead of him, Lucian allowed himself to imagine a future where his daughter might truly come back to him, where she might smile, not just for 5 seconds but for 5 minutes, 5 hours, eventually for whole days at a time, where she might remember what it felt like to be curious about the world, excited about possibilities, engaged with the business of being alive. He thought about Serafina's final words to him, her insistence that Alara would change the world. Maybe she still would, but in ways none of them had ever imagined. Maybe healing herself would teach her things about the human mind that all her academic study never could. Maybe her journey back to wholeness would become the foundation for helping others find their own way back to life. It was too early to hope for such things, Lucian knew. Tomorrow Alara would likely return to her usual state of detached compliance, and there would be no guarantee that music therapy would produce any lasting change. But tonight, for the first time in 3 years, his daughter had smiled. Tonight that was enough. Alara Shaw had been extraordinary from the moment she could form complete sentences. At 3 she'd asked her father why computer screens glowed blue when most light sources appeared white or yellow. At 5 she'd begun teaching herself piano by ear, playing back complex melodies after hearing them just once. By 7 she was reading college-level textbooks and asking questions that made her tutors scramble for answers. But it was her combination of intellectual brilliance and emotional intelligence that had made her truly remarkable. While other gifted youngsters became isolated by their abilities, Alara had possessed an almost supernatural capacity for connecting with people. She could explain quantum physics to a kindergartner and make them laugh while learning. She could debate philosophy with university professors while somehow making them feel heard and valued rather than challenged. At Stanford, where she'd started her doctoral program at 17, Alara had become something of a legend. Her professors spoke in hushed tones about the young woman who'd revolutionized their understanding of neuroplasticity, who'd proposed entirely new models for how memories formed and evolved in response to trauma. Her research focused on developing technology that could help people recover from traumatic brain injuries by essentially rebuilding neural pathways that had been damaged or destroyed. It was ambitious work that combined cutting-edge neuroscience with practical engineering, requiring the kind of interdisciplinary thinking that few people could master. But Alara had made it look effortless. Her doctoral advisor, Dr. Patricia Zimmerman, would later tell colleagues that working with Alara had been like watching Mozart compose symphonies, a natural talent so profound it seemed almost supernatural. Alara could look at brain scans and see patterns that escaped experienced neurologists. She could design experiments that revealed insights about consciousness itself. More importantly, she understood that her work wasn't just academic exercise. Every research proposal began with a story about a real person whose life could be improved by the technology she was developing. A veteran struggling with PTSD who couldn't access memories from before his deployment. A stroke victim who'd lost the ability to recognize faces. A car accident survivor whose personality had been fundamentally altered by frontal lobe damage. Science without compassion is just expensive curiosity. Alara had written in her application to Stanford's doctoral program, "I want to use technology to give people back the pieces of themselves they think they've lost forever." Her professors had been amazed by her ability to maintain that humanistic perspective while working at the. Most researchers became so focused on data and methodology that they lost sight of the real people. Their work was meant to help, but Alara never forgot that behind every brain scan was a human being struggling to feel whole. She'd been particularly drawn to studying selective mutism and other trauma responses that involved emotional withdrawal. Her preliminary research had suggested that these conditions might be treatable using targeted neural stimulation combined with specific sensory inputs, music, art, movement, that could help damaged brains rebuild connections to emotional processing centers. The mind wants to heal itself, she'd explained to her father during one of their weekly lunches. Sometimes it just needs help remembering how. Outside the laboratory, Alara had been equally remarkable. She'd maintained close friendships despite her demanding academic schedule, somehow finding time to mentor younger students and volunteer at local hospitals. She'd been dating a promising architectural student named James Morrison. Their relationship built on shared intellectual curiosity and mutual respect for each other's work. James had been planning to propose after Alara's doctoral defense, which had been scheduled for the following spring. He'd already spoken to Lucien about his intentions, had designed a ring inspired by the neural network diagrams that covered Alara's research notebooks. She makes me want to build spaces that heal people the way her technology will heal minds, James had told Lucien. I think we could change the world together. Alara's personal life had been as thoughtfully constructed as her research. She'd had season tickets to the San Francisco Symphony not just because she loved music but because she'd been studying how different compositional structures affected brain activity. She traveled extensively collecting folk songs and traditional melodies from around the world for a side project exploring the universal elements of music that seemed to transcend cultural boundaries.
Her apartment near campus had been filled with instruments from every continent: African drums, Asian string instruments, European woodwinds, American blues harmonicas. She'd taught herself to play most of them, not for performance, but for research. She'd wanted to understand how different types of musical expression activated different regions of the brain. The last conversation Lucien had with his daughter, before the accident, had been about her plans for the summer. She'd been invited to present her preliminary findings at a conference in Vienna, where some of the world's leading neuroscientists would hear her theories about using music therapy to treat trauma-induced emotional disorders. "I think I'm onto something really important, Dad," she'd told him, her green eyes bright with excitement. "What if we've been approaching trauma treatment all wrong? What if instead of trying to help people process their traumatic memories, we should be focusing on helping them rebuild their capacity for joy, for connection, for all the positive emotions that trauma disrupts?" Her research had suggested that certain musical intervals and rhythmic patterns could stimulate the production of neurotransmitters associated with emotional bonding and contentment. She'd been developing protocols that combined these musical elements with gentle neural stimulation, essentially teaching damaged brains to remember what happiness felt like. The irony was devastating. Alara had been on the verge of breakthrough discoveries about healing emotional trauma, and then she'd become the victim of the exact kind of psychological damage she'd been trying to cure. The accident had happened on a Tuesday night in October, 3 years earlier. Alara had been driving home from a late research session, her mind probably still buzzing with data from the experiments she'd been conducting that day. The intersection where it happened was one she'd navigated hundreds of times, a routine left turn from University Avenue onto a quiet residential street. The drunk driver had been going 60 miles per hour in a 35 zone when he ran the red light. Security camera footage would later show that he'd never even touched his brakes. The impact had been devastating, crushing the driver's side of Alara's small sedan and sending her car spinning into a concrete barrier. Alara had been unconscious for 6 days. When she'd finally awakened, the first words she'd spoken were a question about her research notes, whether someone had made sure to save the data from her experiment that night. Even with a severe concussion and multiple fractures, her first concern had been for her work. The doctors had delivered the diagnosis about her vision with characteristic medical detachment. Severe optic nerve damage, they'd explained. Irreversible, complete bilateral blindness. They'd presented options for adaptive technology, support groups, rehabilitation services, all delivered with the practiced sympathy of professionals who'd given similar news hundreds of times. Lucian had watched his daughter absorb this information with an eerie calm that had worried him more than tears would have. She'd asked practical questions about her prognosis, had requested details about the latest research into optic nerve regeneration, had wanted to understand exactly what had been damaged and whether there were any experimental treatments worth exploring. For the first few weeks, Ilara had seemed to be handling her new reality with remarkable resilience. She'd learned to navigate her hospital room by touch, had started learning Braille, had even joked with nurses about finally having an excuse to avoid reading her advisor's terribly formatted research papers. But as the weeks turned into months, something had begun to shift. The initial determination had given way to a kind of mechanical compliance. Ilara would participate in physical therapy, but without enthusiasm. She'd eat meals, but showed no preference for foods she'd once loved. She'd answer questions, but stopped asking any of her own. The final blow had come when she'd been cleared to return to her research. Lucian had arranged for her entire laboratory to be modified for accessibility, had hired assistants to help her conduct experiments, had invested millions in adaptive technology that would allow her to continue her groundbreaking work. But when Ilara had finally returned to Stanford, she'd sat in her laboratory for exactly 1 hour before asking to go home. She'd never returned. "I can't see the brain scans," she'd explained when her advisor had visited to check on her. "I can't observe the patient's facial expressions. I can't watch how they move, how they respond to stimuli. All my research was based on visual observation, and now I can't see." Her professors had tried to convince her that she could adapt her methodology, that her theoretical knowledge was still invaluable, that losing her sight didn't have to mean losing her calling. But Ilara had been unmoved by their arguments. "I wanted to help people heal from trauma," she'd said quietly. "I don't think I can do that when I'm too broken to heal myself." The withdrawal had accelerated after that. Ilara had stopped leaving her room except when necessary. She'd ended her relationship with James, telling him she couldn't ask him to spend his life with someone who'd become a shadow of the person he'd fallen in love with. She'd declined all communication from her research colleagues, eventually having Lucian inform Stanford that she was withdrawing from the doctoral program entirely. Most devastating of all, she'd stopped engaging with music. The instruments that had filled her apartment were packed away or donated. The piano at the family mansion, where she'd once spent hours composing and experimenting, remained untouched. When asked about it, Ilara had simply said that music reminded her too much of the research she'd been forced to abandon. Dr. Patricia Zimmerman had visited several times during the first year after the accident, trying to convince Ilara to reconsider leaving Stanford. During one particularly emotional conversation, she told Lucian that losing Ilara from the field of neuroscience was like losing Einstein from physics nous, a once-in-a-generation mind, whose absence would leave a hole that might never be filled. She was going to change everything, Dr. Zimmerman had said, tears in her eyes. The work she was doing on music therapy and neural regeneration, it could have helped millions of people. And now she won't even discuss it. The treatments had been Lucian's idea, born from desperation and the inability to accept that his daughter's brilliant mind might be permanently inaccessible. He'd researched every possible intervention, consulted with experts around the world, spent millions on experimental therapies that promised to unlock the secrets of trauma recovery. But each failed treatment had seemed to push Ilara further into herself. She'd submitted to the procedures and evaluations with perfect compliance, but no engagement. When asked how she felt about various interventions, she'd provide clinical assessments. The medication made me drowsy, or the therapy session lasted 45 minutes, without any emotional content. The most heartbreaking moment had come during a family therapy session about 18 months after the accident. The therapist had asked Ilara what she wanted for her future, what goals she had, what would make her happy. Ilara had sat in silence for nearly 5 minutes before answering. "I don't think I want anything anymore," she'd said, her voice as empty as her expression. "I don't think I'm capable of wanting things. That was when Lucian had realized that the accident hadn't just taken his daughter's sight. It had taken her capacity for hope, for desire, for all the emotions that made life worth living. The brilliant young woman who'd once been passionate about changing the world had been replaced by someone who seemed to exist in a state of emotional suspended animation. The search for alternative treatments had become Lucian's obsession. If traditional medicine couldn't reach Alara, maybe something else could. Art therapy, dance therapy, equine therapy, meditation retreats, energy healing. He'd tried everything, always hoping that one of these approaches might find a way past the walls his daughter had built around her heart. But nothing had worked. Each failed intervention had been another confirmation that the person Alara used to be might be gone forever, replaced by this beautiful empty shell who went through the motions of living without any apparent experience of being alive. Until that moment in Orion Reed's studio when a simple melody had somehow reached through 3 years of carefully constructed emptiness and coaxed a smile from his daughter's lips. For 5 seconds, Alara Shah had remembered what it felt like to respond to beauty, to connect with something outside herself, to be human in ways that transcended mere biological functioning. 5 seconds that had given Lucian permission to hope that the extraordinary young woman he'd raised might still be reachable, still be healable, still be capable of becoming herself again. Orion Reed had once been Nashville's most sought-after session musician, the man producers called when they needed someone who could make any song sound like it contained the secrets of the universe. His guitar work had graced platinum albums, his piano arrangements had won Grammy nominations, and his compositions had been covered by artists whose names appeared on magazine covers and concert marquees around the world. At 35, he'd been at the peak of a career that had started in the smoky clubs of Memphis and climbed steadily through the ranks of professional musicians until his name was whispered with reverence in recording studios from Los Angeles to New York. Music industry insiders spoke of his ability to find the emotional core of any song, to understand instinctively what a melody needed to transform from mere notes into something that could move souls. But that had been before the night that changed everything, before the accident that had stolen his music as surely as if someone had cut off his hands. Now, in his weathered studio overlooking the fog-shrouded hills of Ashwood Valley, Orion lived like a monk who'd taken vows of creative silence. The walls were lined with instruments he no longer played, e-guitars that gathered dust, a drum kit whose cymbals had long since lost their shine, keyboards that served as expensive furniture rather than tools of expression. The upright piano where he'd played for Alara Shah was the only instrument he'd touched in 3 years, and even that had been an accident born of muscle memory and momentary carelessness. Orion's retreat to Ashwood Valley had been as much about geography as psychology. The little mountain community was the kind of place where people minded their own business, where you could be known as the guy who fixes old cars, or the woman who grows organic vegetables, without anyone caring about what you'd done before you arrived. He'd bought the studio from an aging folk singer, who'd used it to record one moderately successful album in the 1970s, before discovering that musical fame was more trouble than it was worth. The building had good bones, solid construction, excellent acoustics, enough space for multiple recording setups, but it had been abandoned for nearly a decade when Orion had found it. Restoring the studio had given him something to do with his hands during the long months when he'd been unable to touch any instrument without being overwhelmed by memories. Carpentry was honest work that produced visible results. You could measure progress in square feet of new flooring, in the number of windows that no longer rattled in winter storms. His only companion was his 15-year-old nephew Gideon Stone, whose parents had died in a house fire 2 years earlier. Gideon had come to live with Orion not because they'd been particularly close, but because there'd been no other family willing to take him in. The boy had been as broken by loss as his uncle, though he expressed his damage differently, through angry outbursts and reckless behavior rather than creative paralysis. Gideon was everything. Orion wasn't impulsive where his uncle was careful, loud where Orion preferred silence, constantly moving where his uncle could sit motionless for hours.
The teenager had inherited his family's musical genes, but seemed determined to reject anything that resembled artistic expression, as if beauty itself had become suspect after claiming his parents' lives. The irony wasn't lost on Orion that he'd become responsible for a grieving teenager when he could barely manage his own grief. Most days, their relationship felt less like family and more like two wounded animals sharing the same den, each giving the other enough space to lick their wounds in private. But somehow they'd made it work. Gideon attended the local high school, where his quick wit and complete disregard for authority had made him popular with classmates and a source of constant frustration for teachers. Orion had learned to cook simple meals, to help with homework, to navigate parent-teacher conferences with the awkward determination of someone who'd never planned on raising a teenager. Their evenings followed a predictable routine. Gideon would retreat to his room to video chat with friends or work on mechanical projects. He developed a talent for repairing motorcycles and small engines that kept him busy and provided pocket money. Orion would sit on the studio's back porch, drinking coffee and staring at the hills, while trying not to think about the music that used to live inside his head. The accident that had ended Orion's musical career had happened 3 years earlier, on a rain-soaked highway outside Atlanta. He'd been driving back from a recording session, his mind still buzzing with the day's work on what would become a #1 hit for a country music superstar, whose name everyone would recognize. The session had been one of his best, one of those magical days when everything clicked, when the musicians achieved the kind of telepathic communication that turned good songs into classics. Orion had contributed a piano arrangement that elevated the entire track, weaving through the melody like conversation between old friends. He'd been thinking about that arrangement, mentally replaying the way his hands had found exactly the right chord progressions, when he'd seen the car accident ahead of him on the highway. A family of 4 had been traveling in a minivan when their tire had blown out, sending their vehicle spinning across 3 lanes of traffic before slamming into the concrete barrier. The impact had been devastating, the kind of wreck that left no doubt about the seriousness of the injuries involved. Orion had been among the first to reach the scene. Emergency responders were still 15 minutes away, and the family was trapped in their crushed vehicle with injuries that couldn't wait for professional help. He'd used his phone to call 911 while simultaneously trying to assess the situation. The parents were unconscious but breathing. The teenage son had a broken arm but was alert and talking. But the 8-year-old daughter, Melody Myatt, her name would haunt Orion forever, was in critical condition with what appeared to be severe head trauma. Orion had no medical training beyond basic first aid, but he'd stayed with the little girl while they waited for paramedics, talking to her constantly to keep her conscious, telling her stories and jokes and anything else that might help her focus on something other than her pain. That was when he'd started humming. It had been instinctive, the kind of automatic response that came from a lifetime of using music to comfort and heal. The melody that emerged had been simple and soothing, a lullaby his own mother had sung to him during his childhood illnesses, transformed into something that seemed perfectly suited to a little girl who was fighting to stay alive. Melody had responded to the music immediately. Her eyes had focused on Orion's face, her breathing had stabilized, and she'd even managed a tiny smile when he'd sung a particularly silly verse about dancing elephants and flying mice. When the paramedics had finally arrived, they'd found Orion still singing to the little girl, his voice hoarse from 30 minutes of constant performance, but his melody unwavering. The lead paramedic had later told him that his music had likely saved Melody's life by keeping her calm and conscious during the critical window before professional treatment could begin. But Melody had died anyway. Not at the scene. Neithers the paramedics had successfully stabilized her for transport to the hospital. Not during surgery. The trauma team had worked miracles to repair the damage from her head injury. She died 3 days later from complications that no one had anticipated, a blood clot that had formed despite all the medications and monitoring and round-the-clock care. Orion had spent those 3 days at the hospital, playing music for Melody whenever her parents would allow it. He brought his guitar and played every song he could think of that might appeal to an 8-year-old girl. Disney songs and folk tunes, and simplified versions of classical pieces, all performed with the same attention and skill he'd brought to platinum album sessions. The music had seemed to help. Melody would smile when Orion played, would sometimes hum along or clap her hands weakly. Her parents had been convinced that his presence was therapeutic, that the music was helping their daughter heal. Right up until the moment she died, Orion had been playing Somewhere Over the Rainbow when Melody's monitors had started beeping frantically. He'd continued playing even as nurses rushed into the room, even as doctors had begun emergency procedures, even as it had become clear that nothing they did was going to bring the little girl back. The last thing Melody had heard was Orion's voice singing about a place where troubles melted like lemon drops, where dreams came true, and bluebirds flew over the rainbow. The guilt had been immediate and overwhelming. Orion had convinced himself that his music had somehow failed her, that he'd given her false hope, that he'd used his talent to make promises about healing and comfort that he'd been powerless to keep. Logically, he'd known that music couldn't cure traumatic brain injuries, that his songs had provided comfort rather than false hope, that Melody's death had been the result of medical complications rather than musical inadequacy. But logic had been no match for the crushing weight of feeling responsible for a little girl's final moments. The recording session he'd been returning from when he'd found the accident had produced a song that would go on to win Grammy nominations and top the charts for months. But Orion had never been able to listen to it without thinking about Melody, without wondering if his musical career had somehow been built on a foundation of false promises about the power of art to heal what couldn't be healed. He'd finished his existing recording commitments with mechanical precision, delivering technically perfect performances that lacked any emotional content. Producers had noticed the change immediately. The spark that had made Orion's work special had been replaced by competent but soulless execution. Within 6 months the session calls had stopped coming. Within a year, Orion had sold his Nashville condo and retreated to Ashwood Valley, carrying nothing but his instruments and a nephew who needed someone to take care of him as much as Orion needed someone to take care of him, as much as Orion needed someone to take care of. The music therapy work had started accidentally when a local mother had asked if Orion would play for her autistic son who'd been having severe behavioral problems. Orion had initially refused, but the woman had been persistent, and eventually he'd agreed to try. The results had been remarkable. The boy who'd been nonverbal and prone to violent outbursts had calmed immediately when Orion had started playing simple melodies on an acoustic guitar. Within weeks of regular sessions, the youngster had begun speaking, began interacting with his family in ways that had been impossible before. Word had spread through the community, then through alternative healing networks in Northern California. Soon Orion had been treating trauma victims, autistic individuals, people struggling with depression and anxiety, and PTSD. His studio had become an unofficial clinic where broken people came to find pieces of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. The work had been fulfilling in ways that his commercial success had never been. These weren't paying customers seeking entertainment. They were human beings desperate for connection, for healing, for any intervention that might help them feel whole again. But even that satisfaction had been poisoned by Melody's memory. Every success had felt like a betrayal of the little girl he hadn't been able to save. Every person he'd helped had reminded him of the one person his music had failed when it mattered most. The final straw had come 2 years earlier, when he'd been working with a teenage girl who'd stopped speaking after being sexually assaulted. The therapy had been progressing well. She'd begun humming along with his songs, had started making eye contact, had even spoken a few words during their sessions. Then she died by suicide, on a night when Orion had been too tired to return her phone call, too overwhelmed by his own demons to recognize that someone else's need might be more urgent than his own exhaustion. That was when Orion had stopped taking clients entirely. He'd convinced himself that his music was somehow cursed, that his interventions created false hope, that inevitably led to greater disappointment when reality failed to match the promises implicit in melody and rhythm. The piano where he'd played for Alara Shah had been silent for 3 years before that accidental note had reminded him what it felt like to connect with another human being through sound. For just a moment, he'd remembered what had drawn him to music in the first place. Not the fame or the money, or the professional recognition, but the simple miracle of using organized sound to reach across the space between one soul and another. Alara's smile had been proof that the music was still there, still powerful, still capable of touching something essential in the human spirit. But it had also been a reminder of everything he'd lost, everything he'd given up, everything he'd been too frightened to risk since Melody's death. Now as he prepared for Alara's first official session, Orion found himself caught between hope and terror. Hope that maybe his music could still heal, that maybe Alara's breakthrough had been real and sustainable. Terror that he was about to repeat the same pattern of creating false hope and inevitable disappointment that had defined his last years as a therapist. But Alara's smile had been undeniable. For 5 seconds, his music had reached across 3 years of carefully constructed emptiness and reminded a brilliant young woman what it felt like to respond to beauty. Maybe that was enough to risk trying again. Maybe it was enough to risk believing that music could still be medicine, that melody could still be magic, that broken people could still find ways to help other broken people heal. Maybe 5 seconds of authentic connection was worth whatever pain might follow. The morning after their first meeting, Orion stood in his studio watching fog roll through the valley like slow-motion waves, each tendril catching the early sunlight and transforming it into something that seemed almost solid. He'd been awake since 4 a.m., unable to stop replaying the moment when Alara Shah had smiled at his music, unable to decide whether that smile represented hope or simply another setup for devastating disappointment. Gideon had already left for school, his motorcycle roaring down the mountain road with the kind of reckless enthusiasm that made Orion grateful he couldn't see the boy's riding technique. At 15, Gideon possessed the kind of fearlessness that came from having already lost everything that mattered, also psychological armor that made him simultaneously invulnerable and completely reckless. The coffee in Orion's mug had gone cold while he'd stared out the window trying to make sense of what had happened the previous day. For 3 years he'd successfully avoided any situation that might require him to use music as therapy, had built his entire existence around the principle that his musical gifts were too dangerous to risk unleashing on vulnerable people. Then Lucien Shaw had walked into his studio with his broken daughter, and 5 minutes later, Orion had been playing piano for the first time since Melody's funeral. The song he'd chosen had been automatic, emerging from muscle memory and emotional instinct rather than conscious decision. River of Grace, a melody he'd composed years earlier for a client who'd been struggling with the aftermath of childhood trauma. It was built around gentle flowing phrases that seemed to wash over listeners, like warm water, designed to create a sense of safety and possibility, without demanding any specific emotional response. He'd played it hundreds of times during his therapy years, had watched it help dozens of people find their way back to emotional connection. But he hadn't touched those particular chord progressions since the night he'd decided to stop practicing music therapy entirely. The fact that River of Grace had been the first song to emerge from his fingers felt significant in ways Orion couldn't quite articulate. It was as if his subconscious had chosen the most healing melody in his repertoire, the composition most likely to reach someone who'd been trapped in emotional isolation. And it had worked. Alara's smile had been brief but unmistakable, proof that somewhere beneath her carefully constructed emptiness, the person she used to be was still alive and reachable. The question now was whether Orion had the courage to build on that moment, or whether his fear of failure would once again overwhelm his desire to help. Lucien Shaw was scheduled to bring Alara back at 2 p.m. for what he'd hopefully called their first real session. The terminology made Orion uncomfortable. He'd agreed to work with Alara, but he wasn't ready to call what he was doing therapy. Therapy implied professional competence, systematic methodology, measurable outcomes. What Orion was offering felt more like controlled experimentation, musical improvisation with a human subject rather than evidence-based treatment. He'd spent the morning preparing the studio space, trying to create an environment that would feel safe and welcoming without being obviously therapeutic. Too much preparation might make Alara feel like a patient rather than a person. Too little might waste the fragile momentum her smile had created. The piano bench had been adjusted to accommodate a second person, just in case Alara wanted to sit beside him rather than across the room. He tuned every instrument in the studio, even the ones he had no intention of playing, because perfect pitch had always been important to the quality of his musical interventions. Most importantly, he'd spent time thinking about what song to play first, what musical approach might build on yesterday's breakthrough, without overwhelming Alara with too much stimulation or expectation. When the black Tesla pulled into his gravel driveway at exactly 2 p.m., Orion felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. Through the studio windows, he watched Lucien emerge from the driver's seat with the nervous energy of a man trying to manage expectations while desperately hoping for miracles. Alara moved differently today, Orion noticed. Yesterday she'd been guided by her father's hand, moving with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Today she walked with slightly more confidence, as if she'd mentally mapped the space and felt comfortable enough to move through it independently. "Good afternoon," Lucien said as they entered the studio, his voice carrying forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask his underlying tension. "Alara's been looking forward to this all morning." Orion glanced at Alara, studying her expression for any sign that her father's statement was accurate. Her face remained impassive, but he thought he detected a subtle shift in her posture when her unseeing gaze moved toward the piano. "How are you feeling about being here?" Orion asked Alara directly, deliberately bypassing her father in favor of addressing her as an autonomous person rather than a patient to be managed. "Curious," Alara said, after a moment's consideration. "Yesterday was the first time I've responded to anything in 3 years. I'd like to understand what happened." Her answer surprised Orion with its clinical precision. Most trauma survivors he'd worked with had been reluctant to analyze their responses, preferring to experience healing without intellectualizing the process. But Alara was approaching their work with the systematic thinking of a researcher, apparently determined to understand the mechanisms behind her own recovery.
"What do you think happened?" Orion asked, settling onto the piano bench, but not yet touching the keys. Alara moved to the chair she'd occupied the previous day, her movements suggesting she'd mentally cataloged its location, and felt comfortable claiming that space as her own. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've been thinking about it since yesterday, trying to identify what was different about your music versus all the other stimuli I've been exposed to over the past 3 years. The melody itself wasn't particularly complex or unusual. The harmony was pleasant, but not revolutionary. Yet something about it reached me in a way that nothing else has." Lucien watched this exchange with barely contained excitement, clearly thrilled to hear his daughter engaging intellectually with anything, even if that anything was her own psychological condition. "Maybe it wasn't about the technical aspects of the music," Orion suggested gently. "Maybe it was about the intention behind it, or the emotional content, or just the fact that it was offered without any expectation of a specific response." Alara considered this possibility with the same careful attention she might have once devoted to analyzing research data. "That's possible. Most of my interactions over the past 3 years have involved people wanting something from me, a response, an improvement, a sign that their intervention was working. Yesterday felt different. You weren't trying to fix me." The observation hit closer to home than Orion was comfortable acknowledging. His decision to play piano had indeed been free of therapeutic agenda, emerging from impulse rather than professional methodology. Maybe that lack of expectation had been precisely what allowed Alara to respond authentically. "What would you like from today's session?" Orion asked, deliberately using language that gave Alara control over their interaction. "I'd like to hear more music," she said simply. "Not because I think it will cure me or bring back my sight or make me the person I used to be. Just because for 5 seconds yesterday I remembered what it felt like to enjoy something." The honesty in her statement was both heartbreaking and encouraging. Alara wasn't seeking false hope or miracle cures, she was simply interested in reclaiming the ability to experience beauty, to connect with something outside herself, to feel human in ways that transcended mere survival. "I can do that," Orion said, placing his hands on the piano keys for the second time in 3 years. This time, he chose a different composition, a piece he'd written during his commercial music days, originally intended as background score for a documentary about ocean conservation. The melody captured the rhythm of waves against shoreline, building and receding in patterns that felt both predictable and surprising. As the music filled the studio, Orion watched Alara's face for any sign of response. Her expression remained neutral for the first few phrases, but gradually he began to notice subtle changes. Her breathing seemed to synchronize with the musical phrases. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. Most importantly, she seemed to be actively listening rather than simply tolerating the sound. When the piece concluded, Alara sat in thoughtful silence for nearly a minute before speaking. "That one felt different from yesterday's song," she said. "More complex emotionally. Yesterday's felt like comfort. This one felt like possibility." Her ability to articulate the emotional content of different musical pieces amazed Orion. Most people experienced music emotionally, without being able to translate those feelings into precise language, but Alara was demonstrating the kind of sophisticated musical analysis that usually required years of formal training. "You have an unusual ear for music," Orion observed. "Have you studied composition or music theory?" "Some," Alara admitted. "It was part of my research into how different types of sensory input affected neural development. I was particularly interested in how musical structures might be used to stimulate specific types of brain activity." Lucien leaned forward in his chair, clearly fascinated by this glimpse into his daughter's abandoned academic work. "You were studying music therapy?" "Informally," Alara replied. "I was developing theories about using targeted musical interventions to help people recover from traumatic brain injury. The idea was that certain harmonic progressions and rhythmic patterns might be able to stimulate the production of neurotransmitters associated with emotional bonding and contentment." The irony was staggering. Alara had been researching the exact type of intervention that was now being used to help her heal from her own trauma. Orion felt a chill of recognition, wondering if there was more to their connection than simple coincidence. "What kind of music did your research suggest would be most effective for trauma recovery?" he asked carefully. Alara's expression grew more animated as she discussed her former work, showing the first signs of genuine engagement Orion had witnessed. Simple melodies with clear harmonic structures seemed most promising, nothing too complex or demanding, but with enough musical interest to hold attention. "I was particularly interested in pieces that incorporated repetitive patterns. Apparently the predictability helps damaged brains feel safe enough to begin rebuilding emotional connections." She paused, seeming to recognize the relevance of her own research to her current situation. "I suppose that's exactly what you played yesterday. Simple, clear, emotionally safe but engaging enough to capture attention. Did you ever test your theories?" Orion asked, though something in his gut was already anticipating her answer. "I was planning to begin human trials the summer after my accident," Alara said quietly. "I'd identified several potential subjects, trauma survivors who hadn't responded well to traditional therapy approaches. I wanted to see if targeted musical interventions might help them reconnect with positive emotions." Lucien was staring at his daughter with an expression of wonder and heartbreak. "You never told me about any of this. All this time, you've understood exactly what type of treatment might help you, but you never mentioned your own research." "What would have been the point?" Alara asked, her voice returning to its characteristic emotional flatness. "I couldn't see to conduct the research, couldn't observe patient responses, couldn't analyze the data. My theories were useless without the ability to implement them." Orion felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in his mind. Alara's responsiveness to his music wasn't just the result of therapeutic skill or emotional intuition. It was the result of her own subconscious recognition that she was finally experiencing the exact type of intervention she'd spent years developing. "Maybe your theories weren't useless," he suggested gently. "Maybe they just needed someone else to implement them." For the first time since entering the studio, Alara's expression showed something that might have been hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of someone seeking a miracle cure, but the quiet satisfaction of a researcher whose hypothesis was being confirmed through careful experimentation. Would you be willing to try implementing some of my theoretical approaches? I remember most of my research notes. I could describe the specific types of musical interventions I thought might be most effective. Orion felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with accepting responsibility for someone else's healing. But looking at Alara's face, seeing intelligence and curiosity replacing the emptiness that had defined her for 3 years, he found himself nodding agreement. I'd be honored to test your theories, he said, but I want to be clear about something. I'm not a licensed therapist anymore. I can't promise any specific outcomes. This would be experimental work, based on your research, but without any guarantee of success. I understand, Alara said, but for the first time in 3 years, I feel like I have something to contribute to my own healing. That alone feels like progress. As they scheduled their next session and discussed the practical details of combining Alara's theoretical knowledge with Orion's musical ability, neither of them could have anticipated how their collaboration would soon reveal connections that would challenge everything they thought they understood about healing, responsibility, and the strange ways that broken people could help each other become whole. The accident happened on a Thursday afternoon in late June, when the summer heat had turned Orion's studio into a greenhouse and all the windows were open to catch whatever breeze might drift through the valley. Alara had been working on a complex composition that combined elements of classical structure with the therapeutic progressions from her Stanford research, her fingers moving across the piano keys with growing confidence and sophistication. Gideon had been in the back room, as usual, wrestling with the carburetor of a 1970 Honda motorcycle that had been giving him trouble for weeks. The 15-year-old had developed an almost mystical ability to diagnose engine problems through sound alone, but this particular bike had been defying all his usual troubleshooting approaches. The explosion, when it came, was surprisingly muted, more of a sharp pop than the dramatic blast one might expect from a gasoline engine backfire, but the consequences were immediate and terrifying. Something's wrong, Gideon called from the back room, his voice carrying an edge of panic that made both Orion and Alara freeze mid-conversation. I can't see, something got in my eyes. Orion's reaction was instantaneous and devastating. The sound of Gideon's distress, combined with the acrid smell of burning fuel and the teenager's frightened calls for help, triggered every protective instinct he possessed. But instead of rushing to help, Orion found himself paralyzed by memories that crashed over him like a tsunami. Suddenly he was back on that rain-soaked highway outside Atlanta, listening to Melody's labored breathing, while emergency responders raced against time. He could smell the twisted metal of the family's minivan, could hear the little girl's mother crying as paramedics worked to stabilize her daughter's injuries. His hands began shaking uncontrollably, his vision blurred as panic flooded his nervous system with adrenaline that had nowhere to go. The rational part of his mind understood that Gideon needed immediate help, but his body had essentially shut down in response to trauma triggers he'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. I can't, he whispered, backing away from the direction of Gideon's voice. I can't be responsible for this again. It was Alara who stepped forward, moving with a decisiveness that surprised everyone, including herself. Gideon, I need you to stay exactly where you are and don't touch your eyes, she called out, her voice carrying an authority that cut through the teenager's panic. Can you tell me what happened? The carburetor backfired while I was looking directly into it, Gideon replied, his voice tight with pain and fear. I think gasoline sprayed into my face. Everything's blurry and it burns like hell. Alara was already moving toward the back room, navigating through the studio with the confident precision of someone who'd spent weeks memorizing every obstacle and pathway. Her blindness, which had been a limitation in almost every other context, suddenly became an advantage. She could move efficiently through space without needing to see, while Gideon's temporary vision impairment left him disoriented and frightened. Orion, I need you to call emergency services, she said over her shoulder, but when she heard no response, she realized that he was in the grip of his own crisis and couldn't function as backup support. Instead, she pulled out her phone and made the call herself, providing clear directions to the studio while simultaneously talking Gideon through the immediate steps for treating chemical burns to the eye. The most important thing is to flush your eyes with clean water immediately, she told him, guiding him toward the utility sink in the back room. We need to irrigate for at least 15 minutes to dilute any fuel residue. Her movements were efficient and confident, the product of emergency response training she'd received during her pre-med studies years earlier. Knowledge that had been dormant during her 3 years of withdrawal now emerged with crystalline clarity, as if her mind had been waiting for exactly this moment to remember what it felt like to be useful. How do you know all this? Gideon asked as she carefully positioned his head over the sink and began running lukewarm water over his eyes. Medical training, Alara replied simply. I was pre-med before I switched to neuroscience. Emergency response was part of the curriculum.
What she didn't mention was how good it felt to be helping someone else instead of being the person who needed help. For 3 years, she'd been the broken one, the victim, the person everyone worried about and tried to fix. Now, for the first time since her accident, she was the competent one, the person with knowledge and skills that could make a real difference in someone else's life. As she worked to flush Gideon's eyes, Alara found herself thinking with a clarity she hadn't experienced since her Stanford days. She mentally cataloged his symptoms, assessed the likely extent of damage, and developed a systematic approach to ensuring his safety until professional help arrived. "Can you see any light when I shine my phone's flashlight toward your face?" she asked, testing his pupil response even though she couldn't observe the results herself. "Yeah, I can see bright shapes," Gideon replied. "It's blurry and everything stings, but I'm not completely blind." Relief flooded through Alara at this confirmation that his injury was likely temporary. Gasoline burns to the eyes were serious but rarely caused permanent damage if treated quickly and properly. "That's excellent news," she told him. "It means the corneal damage is probably superficial. Your vision should return to normal once the irritation subsides." By the time the paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, Alara had successfully irrigated Gideon's eyes, assessed his injury as non-life-threatening, and helped him change into clean clothes to remove any fuel residue from his skin. The lead paramedic took one look at her systematic approach and assumed she had medical training. "Are you a nurse?" he asked while examining Gideon's eyes with professional equipment. "Former pre-med student," Alara replied. "I haven't practiced medicine, but the basic emergency response protocols stuck with me." The paramedic nodded approvingly. "You did everything right. Quick irrigation probably saved him from serious corneal damage. He'll need an ophthalmology consult to make sure there's no lasting injury. But your first aid was textbook perfect." Orion had remained frozen throughout the entire emergency response, watching from across the studio as Alara handled a crisis with the kind of competence and calm professionalism he'd once possessed, but could no longer access. The contrast was devastating. Here was a young woman who'd spent 3 years convinced she had nothing to offer the world, demonstrating exactly the kind of skills and knowledge that could save lives. When the paramedics finally departed with Gideon for his hospital evaluation, Orion found himself alone with Alara, in a studio that felt transformed by what had just occurred. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice rough with shame and self-recrimination. "I should have been the one helping him. I should have been able to function when he needed me." Alara turned toward the sound of his voice, her expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "You were having a trauma response. That's not something you can control through willpower, but you were able to function. You stepped up when I couldn't." "I don't have the same triggers you do," Alara pointed out. "Medical emergencies don't remind me of my accident, because my trauma was automotive, not medical. But I guarantee there are situations that would paralyze me while leaving you perfectly functional." Her matter-of-fact analysis of their different vulnerabilities was both comforting and unsettling. She was right that trauma responses were specific and unpredictable, but Orion couldn't shake the feeling that his inability to help Gideon represented a fundamental failure of character. "How did you know what to do?" he asked. "You've been withdrawn from everything for 3 years, but the moment someone needed help, you became completely competent." Alara considered the question carefully before responding. "I think I've been competent all along. I just haven't had any reason to access that competence. Today was the first time in 3 years that someone needed something from me that I could actually provide." The observation hit Orion like a revelation. He'd been thinking of Alara as broken, damaged, someone who needed to be healed before she could contribute anything meaningful to the world. But watching her handle Gideon's emergency had revealed a young woman whose abilities had been dormant, not destroyed. "You saved his vision," Orion said simply. "The paramedic was right. Your quick thinking and proper treatment probably prevented permanent injury." For the first time since the emergency had begun, Alara smiled, not the tentative uncertain expressions he'd grown accustomed to, but a confident satisfied smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "It felt good to help someone," she admitted. "I'd forgotten what it was like to feel useful, to have knowledge and skills that could make a real difference." As they waited for news from the hospital about Gideon's condition, Orion found himself seeing Alara in a completely different light. She wasn't just a trauma survivor who was slowly healing through music therapy. She was a brilliant young woman whose temporary withdrawal had hidden capabilities that might be more powerful now than they'd been before her accident. Her experience with blindness, combined with her medical knowledge and research background, had given her a unique perspective on disability and recovery that could potentially help countless other people. Her understanding of trauma from the inside might make her a more effective healer than any traditionally trained therapist. But even as Orion marveled at this revelation of Alara's hidden strength, neither of them could have anticipated how the day's events would soon uncover a connection between their stories that would challenge everything they thought they understood about healing, responsibility, and the strange ways that broken people could help each other become whole. The call from the hospital came 2 hours later. Gideon's eyes had been thoroughly examined, and the ophthalmologist confirmed that Alara's quick treatment had prevented any serious damage. He would need to use medicated eye drops for a few days, but his vision would return to normal within a week. As they drove to pick up Gideon, Orion couldn't stop thinking about how completely their roles had reversed during the crisis. The person he'd been trying to heal had become the healer, while he'd been reduced to helpless observation. It should have felt like failure, but somehow it felt like the most important breakthrough they'd achieved yet. The revelation came 3 days later, during what should have been a routine session focused on helping Alara process her experience of successfully managing Gideon's emergency. The teenager was recovering well from his eye injury, more embarrassed by his carelessness than seriously affected by the temporary vision problems. But the incident had clearly marked a turning point in Alara's sense of her own capability. She'd arrived at the studio with an energy that Orion had never seen before. Not the tentative engagement of someone slowly awakening from emotional hibernation, but the focused intensity of a researcher who'd stumbled onto a significant discovery. "I've been thinking about what happened on Thursday," she said as soon as they'd settled into their usual positions around the piano. "Not just the emergency itself, but my response to it. The way my medical training came back so clearly, so immediate." Orion nodded, still processing his own feelings about how completely their roles had reversed during the crisis. "You were remarkable. I've never seen anyone handle an emergency with such calm competence." "That's what I wanted to talk about," Alara continued. "I don't think my response was remarkable at all. I think it was exactly what should have happened. Someone with relevant training stepping up when their skills were needed. What was remarkable was how natural it felt, how right it felt to be helping instead of being helped." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think I want to go back to medical school." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that went far beyond career planning. For 3 years, Alara had shown no interest in any future activities, had seemed to exist in a state of suspended animation, where tomorrow was simply another day to be endured. Now she was talking about reclaiming her abandoned dreams, about rebuilding a life that had purpose and direction. "Are you sure?" Orion asked gently. "Medical school is demanding under the best circumstances. Doing it with a visual impairment would add layers of complexity that might be overwhelming." "I've been researching adaptive technologies for visually impaired medical students," Alara replied, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who'd found a problem worth solving. "There are tactile learning systems, audio-based diagnostic tools, collaborative protocols that would allow me to work with sighted partners. It would be challenging, but not impossible." Orion felt a complex mixture of pride and anxiety watching Alara reclaim her ambition. Her recovery had been remarkable, but medical school would expose her to exactly the kinds of stressful situations that might trigger setbacks in her emotional stability. "What kind of medicine are you thinking about?" he asked. "Emergency medicine," Alara said without hesitation. "Or trauma surgery. I want to help people during the worst moments of their lives. I want to be the person who steps up when everything falls apart." The irony was profound. A woman whose life had been shattered by a medical emergency now wanted to dedicate her career to helping other people survive similar crises. But before Orion could respond to her announcement, Lucian Shaw's voice interrupted from the studio doorway. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Lucian said, his expression carrying an urgency that immediately put both Orion and Alara on alert. "But there's something you both need to see." He held up a tablet displaying what appeared to be a news article, though Orion couldn't make out the details from across the room. "What is it?" Alara asked, turning toward her father's voice with the sharp attention she'd developed for detecting emotional nuances in people's vocal tone. Lucian moved closer, his steps heavy with reluctance. "I was researching emergency medicine programs for visually impaired students, trying to find information that might help with your planning. During my search I found an article about a car accident that happened 3 years ago." Orion felt a chill of premonition, some instinctive understanding that whatever Lucian was about to reveal would change everything between them. The accident involved a drunk driver who'd been attending a concert in San Francisco that night. Lucian continued, his voice carefully controlled. "The driver had been drinking at a venue called the Mystic Lounge, where a Nashville session musician was performing. The world seemed to stop moving." Orion knew what was coming next, had known from the moment Lucian mentioned the concert, but understanding and accepting were completely different things. "The musician's name was Orion Reed," Lucian said quietly. "The drunk driver who hit my daughter was leaving your concert." The silence that followed was so complete that Orion could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ear. He stared at Lucian's tablet screen, where a 3-year-old news article displayed a photograph of the Mystic Lounge's marquee advertising special performance by Nashville's Orion Reed on the exact date of Alara's accident. "That's impossible," Orion whispered, but even as he spoke, memories were flooding back with devastating clarity. He remembered that night perfectly. The Mystic Lounge gig had been a favor for an old friend who managed the venue, a special acoustic set to test out new material before recording his next album. It had been an intimate performance, maybe 60 people in the audience, the kind of show where he could experiment with different arrangements and get immediate feedback from music lovers. The crowd had been enthusiastic but respectful, the kind of audience that appreciated subtle musical craftsmanship rather than demanding showmanship. He'd played for nearly 2 hours, including several encores, and had stayed afterward to sign autographs and chat with fans who wanted to discuss the technical aspects of his composition. Among those fans had been a young man who'd seemed pleasant enough at first, but who'd gradually revealed that he'd been drinking heavily throughout the evening. The man had become increasingly insistent about buying Orion drinks, about celebrating what he'd called the best damn concert I've ever heard. Orion had declined the offers, had tried to politely extract himself from the conversation, but the man had been persistent in the way that only drunk people could be. He'd followed Orion to the parking lot, still talking loudly about the music, still trying to convince him to continue the party at another venue. "I remember him," Orion said, his voice barely audible. "Young guy, maybe mid-20s. He kept talking about how my music had changed his life, how he'd never heard anything so beautiful. He was drunk, but I thought he was harmless." Alara had gone very still, her face cycling through emotions too complex to categorize. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but cold. "What was his name?" Lucian consulted the article. "Timothy Walsh, 24 years old. He was sentenced to 8 years for vehicular assault with great bodily injury." "Timothy Walsh," Alara repeated, as if testing how the name felt in her mouth. "The man who destroyed my life was inspired by your music." The accusation hit Orion like a physical blow, not because it was unfair, but because it was completely true. His performance that night had energized Timothy Walsh, had filled him with the kind of euphoric appreciation that drunk people often mistook for profound spiritual experience. If Orion hadn't played that show, Walsh might have gone home earlier, might have been somewhere else entirely when the impulse to drive struck him. "Alara," Lucian said carefully, "Orion isn't responsible for what happened to you. He couldn't have known that someone in his audience would make such a terrible decision, couldn't he?" Alara asked, her voice carrying the sharp logic that had once made her such a formidable debater. He admitted he knew the man was drunk. He saw him in the parking lot, heard him talking irrationally. "What time did your concert end, Orion?" Orion closed his eyes, not wanting to answer but knowing that evasion would only make everything worse. "Around 11:30. My accident happened at 12:15. Alara, 45 minutes after your show ended, just enough time for Timothy Walsh to get in his car, drive across the city, and run a red light at exactly the moment I was making a left turn." The timeline was damning in its precision. If Orion had called the police about Walsh's condition, if he'd insisted that venue security prevent him from driving, if he'd done anything other than simply walking away from an obviously intoxicated fan, Alara might still have her sight. "I didn't know," Orion said desperately. "I had no way of knowing what he would do." "But you suspected he shouldn't be driving," Alara replied. "You said yourself that he was drunk and acting irrationally. You're not responsible for his decision to drive, but you are responsible for not preventing it when you had the opportunity." The accusation was devastating precisely because it echoed every guilt-ridden thought Orion had ever had about Melody's death. Once again his music had been connected to tragedy. Once again he'd failed to take action that might have prevented someone's suffering. "This is why I stopped performing," he said quietly. "This is why I stopped doing music therapy. Every time I try to use music to help people, someone gets hurt." "That's not true," Lucian interjected, but his voice lacked conviction. He was struggling with his own complex emotions. Gratitude for how Orion had helped Alara recover, anger about the connection to her original injury, confusion about how to process such an impossible coincidence.
"Isn't it?" Orion asked. "I performed music that inspired a drunk driver to stay out later than he should have. I sang lullabies to a little girl who died anyway. I've been playing piano for your daughter, convincing all of us that I can help her heal, when I'm actually the person whose negligence contributed to breaking her in the first place." Alara had been listening to this exchange with the kind of focused attention she brought to analyzing research data. When she finally spoke, her words cut through their argument with surgical precision. "The man who failed to protect me and the man who helped me heal. They're the same person," she said, unconsciously echoing the realization that had defined every great love story and tragedy in human history. "Yes," Orion replied simply. "I'm so sorry, Alara. I'm sorry I didn't stop him from driving. I'm sorry my music was part of the chain of events that led to your accident. I'm sorry I've been helping you recover from trauma I should have prevented." Alara stood up from the piano bench and walked toward the studio windows, her movements careful but purposeful. For several minutes, she stared out at the fog-shrouded valley with eyes that couldn't see, processing revelations that would have destroyed most people's ability to trust or hope. When she turned back toward Orion and her father, her expression was unreadable. "I need time to think about this," she said finally. I need to decide whether the man who helped me remember how to smile is worth forgiving for not preventing the reason I stopped smiling in the first place. The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over everything they'd built together, waiting to fall. 3 days passed before Alara returned to the studio, 3 days during which Orion had barely slept or eaten, consumed by the knowledge that he'd been living a lie for months. When Lucian's Tesla finally appeared in the driveway, Orion felt his stomach clench with the certainty that this would be their final meeting. Alara entered the studio alone, having asked her father to wait in the car. Her movements were deliberate and controlled, carrying none of the warmth and familiarity that had characterized her recent visits. She positioned herself in the chair she'd always used, but the space between them felt like a chasm. "I've spent 3 days thinking about what you told me," she began, her voice steady but distant. "About Timothy Walsh, about your concert, about your failure to prevent him from driving. I've analyzed it from every possible angle, emotional, logical, ethical." Orion waited, knowing that whatever came next would determine whether their connection could survive the truth. "I keep coming back to the same question," Alara continued. "If you could go back to that night, knowing what you know now, what would you do differently?" The question hit him like a physical blow, because he'd been asking himself the same thing every hour since the revelation. "I would have called the police," he said without hesitation. "I would have insisted that venue security stop him from driving. I would have taken his keys myself if necessary, even knowing it might have caused a scene, even knowing it might have damaged your reputation as a performer." "Yes," Orion replied firmly. "One person's inconvenience or embarrassment isn't worth another person's life or safety. I should have acted on what I knew was right instead of taking the easy path of walking away." Alara nodded slowly, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already concluded. "That's what I needed to hear. Not excuses or justifications, but acknowledgement of the choice you made, and the choice you would make differently." She leaned forward slightly, her unseeing eyes seeming to focus directly on his face. "Here's what I've realized over the past 3 days. The man who failed to protect me that night was operating from the same moral framework as the man who's helped me heal these past months. You're not two different people, you're one person who made a mistake and learned from it." Orion felt tears beginning to blur his vision. How can you forgive something like that? How can you separate the healing from the harm when they're connected by the same choices, the same person? "Because forgiveness isn't about pretending the harm didn't happen," Alara replied. "It's about choosing to build something meaningful from the pieces of what was broken. You can't undo Timothy Walsh's decision to drive drunk, but you can choose to use that guilt and regret to become someone who would never make the same mistake again." She paused, her voice growing stronger and more certain. "Besides, I'm not the same person who was hurt that night. The accident didn't just take my sight, it also gave me insights into trauma and recovery that I never could have gained through academic study alone. My blindness has taught me to perceive the world in ways that might make me a better doctor than I ever would have been with perfect vision." The words carried an almost mystical quality, as if Alara had found a way to transform her greatest loss into her greatest source of strength. "I've decided to go back to medical school," she continued, "but not to become the doctor I planned to be before the accident. I want to become the doctor that only someone who's experienced trauma and healing could become. I want to specialize in helping people who've been broken by circumstances beyond their control." Orion stared at her with something approaching awe. "You're choosing to find purpose in your suffering." "I'm choosing to find purpose with my suffering," Alara corrected. "There's a difference. I'm not grateful for what happened to me, but I'm grateful for who I've become because of how I've chosen to respond to what happened." She stood up and moved toward the piano, placing her hands on the keys with the same confidence she'd shown during their first breakthrough session months earlier. "Play with me," she said simply. "Play the song you were working on the night Timothy Walsh heard your music. I want to understand what inspired him, what moved him enough to stay out later than he should have." Orion's hands trembled as he joined her at the piano bench. "Are you sure? It might be painful to hear." "I'm sure," Alara said firmly. "I need to know all of it, the beauty that inspired him, and the negligence that failed to protect me. I need to understand the whole story before I can decide how to move forward." Together they began to play the haunting melody that had filled the Mystic Lounge 3 years earlier, the song that had so moved Timothy Walsh that he'd lingered in the venue drinking and celebrating long past the point of safety. As the music filled the studio, Alara's expression shifted from careful control to something approaching peace. "It's beautiful," she said softly when the last notes faded away. "I can understand why it moved him. I can understand why he wanted to stay and celebrate the experience of hearing something so perfect." "Does that make it worse or better?" Orion asked. "It makes it human," Alara replied.
Beautiful art, inspiring terrible choices, healing music connected to devastating consequences. It's all part of the same complicated truth about what it means to be alive. She turned toward him with a smile that seemed to contain all the wisdom she'd gained through months of recovery. I forgive you, Orion, not because what happened wasn't serious, but because holding on to anger would prevent both of us from becoming who we're meant to be. 8 months later, the Ashwood Valley Trauma Recovery Center occupied a renovated medical facility, overlooking the same fog-covered hills where Orion and Alara had first discovered their connection. The building buzzed with the kind of purposeful energy that came from meaningful work, where broken people helped other broken people remember what it felt like to be whole. Alara moved through the center's corridors with the confident stride of someone who had found her calling. She was halfway through her first year at UCSF Medical School, pursuing a specialized track in emergency medicine with a focus on trauma recovery. Her professors marveled at her ability to connect with patients who had lost hope, her intuitive understanding of what it meant to rebuild a life from fragments. Dr. Shaw called Maria Santos, a car accident survivor who had been mute for 6 months before beginning treatment at the center. Can you listen to the song I wrote? I think I'm ready to play it for my family. Alara smiled, hearing the excitement in Maria's voice that meant another breakthrough was happening. I'd be honored to hear it. Should we ask Orion to join us? The center's treatment model was revolutionary in its simplicity. Traditional medical intervention combined with music therapy, all guided by practitioners who understood trauma from the inside. Alara provided medical expertise and emotional support born from lived experience, while Orion created therapeutic musical interventions tailored to each patient's specific need. But perhaps most importantly, they offered something that couldn't be taught in medical school or music conservatory, proof that healing was possible, that people could survive devastating loss and build meaningful lives from whatever pieces remain. Gideon, now 17 and a senior in high school, had become an unofficial mascot of the center. His mechanical skills had evolved into a gift for creating adaptive technologies that help patients with various disabilities engage more fully with their treatment. He designed tablet holders for patients with limited mobility, modified instruments for people with hand injuries, and developed communication devices for those struggling with speech. Alara's teaching me about the connection between fine motor skills and emotional expression. He'd told a visiting journalist who was writing about the center's innovative approaches. Turns out there's actual science behind the idea that working with your hands helps heal your heart. The center had been funded by a foundation that Lucian had established in Serafina's memory, combining his technological resources with his daughter's clinical insights and Orion's therapeutic expertise. But the real magic happened in the daily interactions between staff and patients, in the moment when someone who had given up hope began to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. On this particular evening, as the last patients departed and the building settled into peaceful quiet, Alara and Orion found themselves alone in the main treatment room where everything had started months earlier. Do you ever think about alternate timeline? Alara asked, settling beside Orion on the piano bench where they'd shared so many breakthrough moments. What our lives would have been like if Timothy Walsh had made different choices that night. Orion placed his hands on the piano keys, finding the gentle melody that had become their signature piece, a composition they'd written together that captured the experience of rebuilding hope from despair. I used to think about that constantly, he admitted, but I've stopped wondering about the life I might have had and started appreciating the life I actually have, even knowing that this life was built on tragedy, especially knowing that, Orion replied, anyone can build something beautiful when everything goes according to plan. It takes real strength to create meaning from chaos, love from loss, healing from hurt. Alara leaned against his shoulder as he played, feeling the vibrations of the music through her body in ways that sighted people rarely experienced. Maria wrote a song today about learning to trust again. Mrs. Patterson painted her first landscape since her husband's death. David spoke his daughter's name out loud for the first time since the accident. And tomorrow there will be more, Orion said softly. More people who need to know that broken doesn't mean worthless, that wounded doesn't mean worthless. As if summoned by their conversation, Gideon appeared in the doorway with Lucian close behind. The four of them had become an unlikely family, bound together not by blood or law but by the shared understanding that love meant choosing to care for each other, despite and because of their individual damages. How was your evening session? Lucian asked, settling into one of the comfortable chairs they'd placed around the piano for family conversations. Transformative, Alara replied, the word carrying weight accumulated over months of witnessing daily miracles. I think we're ready to expand the program. There are so many people who need what we're offering. Speaking of expansion, Gideon said with the grin that meant he had news to share. I got accepted to UC Berkeley's engineering program. They have a specialized track in adaptive technology design. The announcement filled the room with the kind of celebration that had become their family's signature, quiet but profound. acknowledging progress, while remaining grounded in gratitude for what they already possess. As the evening light faded and fog began to roll through the valley, the four of them sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts about the strange journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect imperfection. Olara had learned to see with her heart instead of her eye. Orion had rediscovered that music could heal when offered with humility rather than pride. Gideon had found purpose in creating solutions for problems most people never notice. Lucian had discovered that the greatest legacy wasn't built in boardrooms, but in moments of genuine connection between wounded souls. "I love you all," Olara said suddenly, her words carrying the weight of someone who had learned the difference between surviving and thriving. "We love you too," came the chorus of responses, three voices creating harmony around the simple truth that had become their foundation. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, and somewhere in the distance, another broken person was taking their first tentative steps toward believing that tomorrow might hold possibilities they couldn't yet imagine. The phoenix had risen, not despite the ashes, but because of them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.